The richest woman in the building thought the security guard was invisible. 3 months later, she would discover he had sacrificed a fortune for a little girl sleeping down the hall. Sophie Whitmore did not believe in second chances. She believed in performance reports, quarterly earnings, and measurable results. At 38 years old, she had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. Business magazines called her brilliant. Investors called her unstoppable. Employees called her demanding when she was not around to hear it. Sophie preferred it that way. Respect was easier than affection. Numbers were easier than people. Yet on a cold October evening, standing in the lobby of a luxury residential complex owned by her company, Sophie felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel. Exhaustion. A public relations crisis had exploded across social media during the previous week. Reporters camped outside her penthouse. Cameras followed her car. Every decision became a headline. Her board recommended something unusual: move temporarily into one of the private executive residences owned by the company. Stay out of sight. Let the storm pass. Sophie hated the idea, but she hated losing control even more. The black SUV stopped in front of the building. Sophie stepped out carrying a leather bag and enough frustration to fill the entire lobby. Rain tapped softly against the glass entrance. The city lights shimmered through the wet evening air. Then she noticed him. A man wearing a security uniform stood near the reception desk. He looked calm, too calm. While everyone else seemed stressed by the constant activity around the building, he appeared completely unbothered. "Good evening," he said politely. "Welcome." Sophie barely glanced at him. "I already know where I am." The man nodded. "Of course. Then why are you greeting me?" "Because it is my job." Sophie exhaled sharply. The answer irritated her for reasons she could not explain. Perhaps because it sounded genuine. She collected her luggage and headed toward the elevator. The security guard stepped forward. "Ma'am." Sophie stopped. "What?" "The executive elevator is being serviced tonight." She closed her eyes briefly. "Perfect. The west elevator is available." "Wonderful. Would you like help with your bags?" Sophie looked at him for the first time. Really looked at him. Early 40s. Ordinary appearance. Security uniform. Wedding ring absent. Kind eyes. Nothing remarkable. At least that was her first impression. "No," she replied. "I can manage." "All right." His voice remained calm. "Have a good evening." The elevator doors closed between them. Sophie shook her head. She disliked conversations that served no purpose. Upstairs, the executive residence felt elegant but impersonal. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Modern furniture filled every room. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt empty. Sophie set her bag down and walked toward the window. Far below, traffic lights moved through the darkness like rivers of color. The silence inside the apartment felt unusually loud. Meanwhile, downstairs, Mason Carter returned to his security station. He reviewed visitor logs, monitored security cameras, and answered routine calls. Nothing about his behavior suggested resentment. Many people treated him dismissively. He rarely reacted. Experience had taught him something important. Character revealed itself during ordinary moments, not dramatic ones. Around 9 o'clock, his phone vibrated. A smile immediately appeared on his face. "Hey, kiddo." "Dad, you are late." "I know. You promised ice cream." Mason laughed quietly. "I remember." 11-year-old Emma Carter sounded disappointed. "Chocolate chip cookie dough." "I know. Not vanilla." "I definitely know." Emma giggled. The sound brightened his entire evening. "I saved you some dinner. You are the best roommate a father could ask for." "I know that too." Mason smiled toward the security monitors. Nearby residents passed through the lobby without noticing him. Most never did. But none of that mattered. His daughter did. Upstairs, Sophie stepped onto her balcony, hoping fresh air might clear her thoughts. The city stretched endlessly before her. Then she noticed something below. Through the lobby windows, she could see the security desk. The same guard sat there talking on his phone. He was smiling. Not the artificial smile people used in meetings. A real one. Warm. Unforced. For reasons she could not explain, Sophie found herself watching for several seconds. Then she shook her head and stepped back inside. It was none of her business. The security guard was simply a security guard. Or at least, that was what she believed. What Sophie Whitmore did not know was that the quiet man she had dismissed in less than 30 seconds was carrying a secret powerful enough to change everything she thought she understood about success, sacrifice, and the true meaning of wealth. The next morning began exactly the way Sophie Whitmore preferred. Early, structured, predictable. Unfortunately, the world seemed determined to ignore her preferences. By 7 o'clock, 3 reporters had already discovered the general area where she was staying. Her assistant called twice. The board chairman called once. An investor left a voicemail marked urgent. Sophie ended the final call and stared out the apartment window. The city looked beautiful from 30 floors above the street. Yet beauty did not reduce pressure. Deadlines still existed. Expectations still existed. Problems still existed. She grabbed her laptop and headed downstairs. The lobby was quiet except for one familiar figure standing near the security desk. Mason Carter was helping an elderly resident carry several grocery bags toward the elevator. "Thank you, young man," the woman said warmly. "You do too much." Mason smiled. "I hear that a lot. You should charge extra. Then people might stop asking." The woman laughed. Sophie walked past them without speaking. The elevator doors opened. Just before they closed, she noticed something strange. The elderly woman reached over and squeezed Mason's arm affectionately. Not because he worked there, because she genuinely liked him. Sophie dismissed the thought immediately. Charisma was not difficult. Results were difficult. Upstairs, she buried herself in meetings. Video calls filled her schedule. Financial forecasts occupied her attention. Crisis management strategies consumed most of the afternoon. Hours passed without pause. Around 4 o'clock, she finally stepped away from her screen. Her head ached. Her patience had disappeared. Her coffee had gone cold. The day felt endless. Deciding fresh air might help. Sophie headed downstairs and exited through the rear entrance of the building. The small community courtyard behind the residence surprised her. Trees shaded walking paths. Children played near a fountain. Several residents relaxed on benches. The atmosphere felt calm, almost peaceful. Then she spotted Mason again. This time he sat beside a little girl holding 2 ice cream cones. Sophie immediately recognized her from the previous evening's phone call. The girl looked around 11 years old. She was laughing about something. Mason appeared equally amused. "Dad, you promised 1 scoop. That is technically 1 scoop. That scoop is the size of Texas. I am a generous father." The girl grinned. "You are a sneaky father." Sophie slowed her pace without meaning to. The interaction felt oddly genuine. Most adults she knew barely had time for family dinners. Yet this security guard seemed completely present, completely engaged. The girl suddenly noticed Sophie. "Hi." Sophie stopped. "Hello." Mason looked up. "Good afternoon." His voice carried the same calm politeness as before. Sophie nodded briefly. "Your daughter?" "Emma." Emma smiled brightly. "Nice to meet you." Sophie hesitated. She was not particularly skilled at conversations with children. "Nice to meet you too." Emma studied her carefully. Children often possessed an uncomfortable ability to notice things adults missed. "You look sad." Sophie blinked. "Excuse me." "You look sad." Emma shrugged. "Not all the way sad. Just a little." Mason immediately looked embarrassed. "Emma." "What?" "We do not analyze strangers." Emma smiled unapologetically. Sophie surprised herself by laughing softly. It was the first genuine laugh she had experienced in days. Emma pointed toward the second ice cream cone. "Do you want this?" Sophie stared at her. "You are offering me your ice cream?" "Dad says sharing is nice." Mason shook his head. "I say many things." Sophie looked at the cone, then at Emma, then at Mason. Something about the simplicity of the moment felt unfamiliar. Nobody wanted anything from her. Nobody was negotiating. Nobody was presenting a proposal. It was simply kindness. "Thank you," Sophie said. "But you should keep it." Emma nodded. "Okay. Problem solved." Sophie continued walking through the courtyard. Yet the conversation lingered in her thoughts longer than expected. Later that evening, a thunderstorm rolled across the city. Rain hammered against the building. Wind rattled windows. Around 9 o'clock, a brief power outage affected part of the property. Emergency systems activated immediately. Residents became nervous. Phone calls flooded the front desk. Sophie stepped into the hallway and found several people gathering near the elevators. At the center of the activity stood Mason. Calm, focused, reassuring everyone. "The generators are working. Maintenance is checking the issue. Everything is under control." Residents relaxed almost instantly. His confidence seemed contagious. Within minutes, order returned. As Sophie watched from across the lobby, she realized something unexpected. Nobody here treated Mason like an ordinary security guard. They trusted him, respected him, relied on him. And although she could not yet explain why, she was beginning to suspect there was far more to Mason Carter than the uniform he wore every day. The following week brought a change Sophie Whitmore never expected. She started noticing Mason Carter even when he was not speaking to her. Not because he demanded attention. Quite the opposite. Mason seemed to move through the building quietly, helping people without ever drawing attention to himself. One morning, she watched him carry boxes for a resident recovering from surgery. Later that afternoon, he spent 20 minutes helping an elderly couple program a new television remote. That evening, he stayed after his shift ended because a teenager locked himself out of an apartment and felt embarrassed asking for help. None of those tasks appeared in a job description. Yet Mason handled each one with the same patience and respect. Sophie found herself wondering why. Most people did only what they were paid to do. Mason consistently did more. One Saturday morning, Sophie entered the lobby carrying her laptop and a folder full of reports. A difficult board meeting awaited her. She already felt irritated before the day began. As she approached the elevator, a familiar voice stopped her. "Miss Sophie." Sophie turned. Emma stood near the security desk, holding a sketchbook. "Good morning." Emma smiled. "Dad said you work too much." Across the lobby, Mason nearly dropped the coffee he was holding. "Emma." "What?" Emma looked confused. "You did say that." Sophie surprised herself by laughing. Mason shook his head. "I apologize." "Do not." Sophie smiled slightly. "It is probably accurate." Emma opened her sketchbook. "I drew something." Sophie hesitated. Nobody had shown her a drawing in years. Investors showed presentations. Executives showed spreadsheets. Children rarely appeared in her world. "Can I see?" Emma handed over the sketchbook. Inside was a carefully colored drawing of the residential building. Small figures stood outside. Trees lined the courtyard. Bright sunlight filled the scene. Sophie noticed one detail immediately. Every person in the picture was smiling. "This is beautiful," she said honestly. Emma beamed. "Dad says buildings are really just people." Sophie looked toward Mason. "He says that." Mason shrugged. "Something like that." Sophie studied the drawing again. The idea lingered in her mind long after she left. Buildings are really just people. Strange. Simple. Yet somehow meaningful. Later that afternoon, Sophie returned from her board meeting exhausted. The discussion had been difficult. Several directors questioned her decisions. Others questioned her leadership. Although she remained composed throughout the meeting, the criticism followed her home. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the lobby button. Instead of returning directly upstairs, she walked outside into the courtyard. The autumn air felt cool and quiet. Nearby, Emma sat on a bench working on homework while Mason repaired the loose wheel of a resident stroller. "You know you are off duty, right?" Sophie asked. Mason looked up. "I do." "Then why are you fixing that?" "Because it needs fixing." The answer arrived so naturally that Sophie almost laughed. "That is not really an explanation." Mason tightened a bolt and smiled. "Maybe not." Emma looked up from her homework. "Dad fixes everything." "That sounds exhausting," Sophie replied. Emma nodded seriously. "It probably is." For a few moments, the three sat together in comfortable silence. The city noise felt distant. Leaves drifted across the courtyard. Somewhere nearby, children laughed near the fountain. Sophie realized she had not experienced a peaceful moment like this in years. Her life moved too fast. Her schedule left little room for stillness. Yet Mason seemed completely comfortable with it. Finally, Sophie asked a question she had been considering for days. "How long have you worked security?" Mason looked thoughtful. "Long enough." "That is a very mysterious answer." "I am not trying to be mysterious." Emma grinned. "He does that all the time." Sophie laughed again. The sound surprised even her. Then something unusual happened. For the first time since moving into the residence, Sophie forgot about reporters. Forgot about investors. Forgot about headlines. She simply sat on a bench talking with a security guard and his daughter. The moment felt ordinary, yet somehow important. As evening approached, Sophie returned upstairs carrying a strange feeling she could not quite identify. Respect. Not for Mason's job title. Not for his position. Respect for the quiet strength with which he lived his life. And while she still believed he was simply a security guard, she was beginning to realize that some people carried a kind of wealth that could never appear on a balance sheet. The more Sophie Whitmore observed Mason Carter, the more confused she became. Confusion was not an emotion she enjoyed. Throughout her career, she built success by understanding situations quickly. She identified strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and risks with remarkable accuracy. People often praised her instincts. Yet Mason refused to fit into any category she recognized. One Monday morning, she witnessed him helping a delivery driver whose truck had broken down near the loading area. By lunch, he was carrying groceries for an elderly resident. Later that afternoon, he spent nearly an hour teaching a teenage boy how to prepare for a job interview. None of these actions seemed connected. None offered obvious rewards. Yet Mason treated each person with the same patience and dignity. Sophie finally asked one of the building managers about him. "How long has Mason worked here?" The manager smiled immediately. "A few years. People seem to like him." The manager laughed softly. That might be the understatement of the century. Sophie looked surprised. "Really? Residents request his schedule before they schedule maintenance appointments. Why?" "Because they trust him." The answer sounded simple. Yet Sophie found herself thinking about it long after the conversation ended. Trust. It was one of the most valuable currencies in business. One of the rarest as well. That evening, Sophie returned from a difficult strategy meeting feeling drained. Rain tapped gently against the building windows. The lobby glowed warmly beneath soft lighting. Mason sat behind the security desk reviewing paperwork while Emma completed homework nearby. The scene looked peaceful, almost comforting. Emma noticed Sophie first. "Hi." Sophie smiled. "Good evening." Emma held up a math worksheet. "Do you know fractions?" Sophie laughed. "I run a technology company." Emma nodded seriously. "So that is a no." Mason covered his face with one hand. Sophie laughed harder than she had in weeks. "Actually, I know fractions." "Good." Emma pushed the worksheet toward her. "Because Dad explains everything using baseball statistics." Mason looked offended. "That is a perfectly reasonable teaching method." "Not for fractions." Sophie sat beside Emma and reviewed the worksheet. What began as a quick explanation turned into 20 minutes of homework assistance. When they finally finished, Emma looked proud of herself. "I got them all right." Sophie smiled. "You did." Emma gathered her books. "Thanks." Then she headed toward the elevators, leaving Sophie and Mason alone for the first time. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain continued falling outside. The lobby remained quiet. Finally, Mason smiled. "She likes you." Sophie looked surprised. "Really? Emma is honest about people." "That sounds dangerous." "Sometimes." Sophie laughed softly. Then her expression became thoughtful. "You have done a remarkable job with her." Mason looked toward the elevator Emma had just entered. Pride filled his eyes. "She makes it easy." The answer carried so much sincerity that Sophie felt something unexpected. Respect. Genuine respect. Over the next several days, small moments continued accumulating. Sophie discovered that Mason volunteered at a local community center on weekends. She learned he delivered meals to homebound seniors once a month. She noticed residents stopping by the security desk simply to say hello. More surprising than any individual action was the consistency behind them. Mason never seemed to perform kindness for recognition. He behaved the same whether people noticed or not. One afternoon, Sophie encountered him outside the building repairing a bench in the courtyard. "Do maintenance workers know you are stealing their job?" she asked. Mason smiled. "I asked permission." "Of course you did." He tightened a bolt. "Besides, somebody should fix it." Sophie leaned against a nearby railing. "You spend a lot of time helping people." "Maybe." "Why?" Mason considered the question carefully. The afternoon sunlight filtered through orange autumn leaves. Children played near the fountain. The world felt unusually calm. "Because somebody helped me once," he finally said. Sophie waited for more. None came. "That is it." Mason nodded. "That is enough." The simplicity of the answer stayed with her. Most executives, she knew, could not answer a question without turning it into a presentation. Mason answered profound questions using a single sentence. Yet somehow his responses felt more meaningful than most speeches she had heard. As the sun slowly lowered toward the horizon, Sophie realized something important. The security guard she originally dismissed was teaching her lessons without ever trying to. Lessons about character, about humility, about what success looked like when measured by lives touched instead of money earned. And while she still knew almost nothing about Mason's past, she was beginning to understand why every resident in the building seemed to respect him. Because true influence did not come from titles, wealth, or power. It came from the quiet decision to make other people's lives a little better whenever possible. And Mason Carter made that decision every single day. By the beginning of the second month, Sophie Whitmore had stopped seeing Mason Carter as simply the security guard in the lobby. What surprised her most was that she could not identify exactly when the change happened. There was no dramatic moment, no emotional speech, no grand gesture. Respect had arrived quietly, one ordinary day at a time. Yet another mystery continued growing in the back of her mind. Everyone respected Mason. Everyone trusted him. Everyone seemed grateful for his presence. But nobody ever explained why. The admiration felt deeper than friendliness. It felt earned. One Tuesday afternoon, Sophie overheard two residents talking near the elevators. "I still do not know what we would have done without Mason." "Neither do I. Good people are rare. He is more than good." Sophie waited for more. The conversation ended there. Later that day, she heard something similar from a maintenance supervisor. The following morning, a resident described Mason as the most dependable man she had ever met. Every compliment sounded sincere. Every compliment sounded personal. Yet none revealed the full story. Curiosity slowly replaced skepticism. One evening, Sophie returned from work later than usual. The crisis that had forced her into temporary residence was finally beginning to fade. Reporters no longer followed every movement. Board meetings felt calmer. For the first time in weeks, she arrived home before sunset. As she crossed the lobby, she noticed Emma sitting alone near the reception desk. "Where is your father?" Sophie asked. Emma looked up from a book. "Helping Mr. Henderson." "Who is Mr. Henderson?" "Apartment 1704. Emma smiled. "He pretends he does not need help." Sophie laughed softly. "And does he?" "Absolutely." 10 minutes later, Sophie found the answer herself. Through a hallway window, she spotted Mason carrying several heavy storage boxes into an apartment while an elderly man attempted to insist he could do it himself. Mason listened patiently. The elderly resident complained. Mason smiled. The boxes still ended up exactly where they needed to go. Sophie watched for a moment before continuing upstairs. Something about the interaction stayed with her. Mason never seemed annoyed, never seemed rushed. Most people she knew guarded their time aggressively. Mason gave his away freely. A few days later, another moment caught her attention. A young employee from the building management office sat alone in the courtyard looking upset. Sophie recognized him vaguely but did not know his name. As she walked past, Mason quietly sat beside him. No speeches followed. No dramatic advice. The two simply talked. 20 minutes later, the young man stood up smiling. Whatever burden he carried appeared lighter. Sophie found herself staring. "You are doing it again." Mason looked up. "Doing what?" "Helping people." Mason smiled. "It is not very exciting when you say it like that. You make it sound normal." "Maybe it is." Sophie shook her head. "Not where I come from." The answer escaped before she could stop it. Mason studied her for a moment. Then his expression softened. "That sounds lonely." The words landed harder than she expected. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. For years, Sophie had surrounded herself with talented people, successful people, ambitious people, yet genuine kindness often felt rare. She changed the subject immediately. "You know, everyone talks about you." Mason laughed. "That sounds dangerous. Nobody explains why they respect you so much. You would have to ask them." "I am asking you." Mason considered the question. Evening sunlight painted long shadows across the courtyard. Emma chased autumn leaves nearby, while residents enjoyed the cool weather. The moment felt peaceful. "People have been kind to me throughout my life," Mason said quietly. "I try to return the favor." Sophie waited. Again, that was all he offered. Somehow the simple answer felt more authentic than anything more complicated. Later that night, Sophie sat alone in her apartment reflecting on the conversation. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows. Silence filled the room. Yet her thoughts remained focused on one question. Why did someone like Mason choose a life that seemed so small compared to the impact he had on others? There was a story hidden somewhere beneath the surface. She felt certain of it now. A story involving sacrifice. A story involving loss. A story involving choices most people would never understand. Downstairs, Mason finished his shift and prepared to head home with Emma. As father and daughter walked toward the parking garage together, they laughed about homework, ice cream, and weekend plans. Simple things. Beautiful things. Watching from her window above, Sophie felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Admiration. And for the first time, She genuinely wanted to know the man behind the uniform. The turning point arrived on a gray Thursday morning when Sophie Whitmore received a phone call that made her stomach drop. One of the company's largest software deployments had failed unexpectedly. A critical client was threatening to terminate a multi-million-dollar contract. Executives flooded her inbox. Emergency meetings filled her calendar. Within hours, the comm she had worked so hard to rebuild disappeared. By noon, Sophie sat alone inside a conference room at company headquarters, staring at reports scattered across the table. The numbers looked terrible. The technical explanations sounded even worse. Every proposed solution seemed incomplete. Every executive appeared nervous. For the first time in months, she felt genuinely overwhelmed. When the meeting finally ended, she drove back to the residential complex exhausted. Rain covered the windshield. Traffic moved slowly. Her thoughts moved even slower. By the time she entered the lobby, frustration had replaced patience. Mason noticed immediately. Rough day. Sophie laughed without humor. That obvious? A little. She shook her head. My company is dealing with a serious problem. I am sorry to hear that. Most people would have offered advice immediately. Mason did not. He simply listened. Somehow that felt refreshing. Sophie sighed. Everyone keeps talking. That can happen. Nobody is actually solving anything. Mason nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes people get so busy discussing a problem that they stop looking at it. Sophie stared at him. What does that mean? Probably nothing. He smiled. Just something I learned. Yet the comment followed her upstairs. That evening, she reviewed reports again. Then she remembered Mason's words. Stop discussing the problem. Look at it. Hours later, she did something unusual. She ignored every summary prepared by her executives and examined the original customer feedback herself. The pattern appeared almost immediately. The issue was not where everyone believed it was. The client had been describing a completely different failure point from the one her team was trying to fix. Sophie sat upright. For the first time all day, she felt hopeful. The next morning, she called an emergency meeting. Within minutes, her engineers confirmed the discovery. The solution became obvious once the correct problem was identified. By lunchtime, the crisis that threatened the entire contract was finally under control. Relief spread throughout the company. Investors relaxed. Executives celebrated. Sophie remained quiet, because she knew exactly where the breakthrough originated. That evening, she found Mason in the courtyard helping Emma study for a science quiz. You were right. Mason looked confused. About what? The problem. Which problem? Sophie laughed. See, this is what makes talking to you frustrating. Emma looked delighted. I told you he does that. Mason smiled. Sophie sat beside them and explained what happened. When she finished, Mason nodded politely. Sounds like your team solved it. After you pointed me in the right direction. I did not solve anything. You helped. Mason looked uncomfortable with the praise. Sophie was beginning to notice that about him. Recognition seemed to make him uneasy. Gratitude did not. Emma suddenly spoke up. Dad is good at fixing complicated things. Sophie smiled. I am starting to notice. For a moment, all three laughed together. The interaction felt natural now. Weeks earlier, Sophie could barely imagine sharing a casual conversation with a security guard and his daughter. Now those conversations had become the most relaxing part of her day. Later that night, Sophie reflected on everything that had happened. Rain tapped softly against her apartment windows. City lights shimmered beyond the glass. Yet her thoughts remained focused on Mason. The more she learned about him, the less ordinary he seemed. He understood people unusually well. He solved problems instinctively. He communicated with a calm confidence that suggested experience far beyond his current position. Most surprising of all, he never seemed interested in proving himself. Sophie had spent years surrounded by ambitious people desperate to demonstrate intelligence. Mason possessed intelligence but appeared completely unconcerned with displaying it. The contrast fascinated her. Downstairs, long after most residents had gone to sleep, Mason completed paperwork at the security desk. Emma rested nearby with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders while finishing a book. The scene looked simple, ordinary, yet Sophie could not shake the feeling that a much larger story existed beneath the surface. Because people like Mason Carter did not accidentally become extraordinary. Something had shaped him. Something had taught him patience, wisdom, and grace. And although she still did not know the secret he carried, Sophie was beginning to realize that whatever truth waited in his past might be far more remarkable than anything she could imagine. The secret began revealing itself completely by accident. Sophie Whitmore was not searching for answers that afternoon. She was simply trying to escape another long series of executive meetings. The company crisis had finally settled. Investors were satisfied. Clients were calm. Yet exhaustion still followed her everywhere. She entered a quiet conference room inside company headquarters hoping for a few minutes alone. Instead, she found a conversation already in progress. Two senior board members stood near the windows speaking in low voices. Sophie would have left immediately, but one sentence stopped her. "I still cannot believe Mason Carter disappeared." The name caught her attention instantly. She paused. "Disappeared?" the second executive asked. The first nodded. "One day he was everywhere. The next day, gone." Sophie stepped forward. "Excuse me." Both men turned. "Do either of you know a Mason Carter?" The reaction was immediate. Confusion appeared on both faces. "You know Mason Carter?" one asked. Sophie frowned. "He works security at one of our residential properties." Silence filled the room. The executives exchanged a glance that Sophie did not understand. Finally, one of them laughed softly. "Security?" Sophie crossed her arms. "What is so funny?" "Nothing." The man looked genuinely stunned. "It is just difficult to imagine." Sophie felt her pulse quicken. Imagine what? The older executive pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. 10 years ago, Mason Carter was one of the most respected software architects in the country. Sophie stared at him. "What?" The room suddenly felt smaller. He co-founded one of the earliest cloud infrastructure companies during the industry's growth years. Sophie blinked. "That is impossible." "No." The executive shook his head. "It is absolutely true." More details followed. Each one seemed harder to believe than the last. Mason had built technology platforms used by millions. Major companies competed for his expertise. Investors considered him a visionary. Several publications featured him regularly. Then, almost overnight, he vanished. Interviews stopped. Appearances ended. Opportunities disappeared. Nobody seemed to know why. Sophie left the room feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted. Throughout the drive back to the residence, fragments of information replayed in her mind. The calm confidence, the unusual problem-solving skills, the way he understood people, the way he never chased recognition. Suddenly everything made sense. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why would someone walk away from a life like that? That evening she found Emma sitting in the courtyard reading. Autumn leaves drifted across the pathways. The setting sun painted everything gold. Sophie sat beside her. "Can I ask you something?" Emma smiled. "Sure." Sophie hesitated. "What did your dad do before security work?" Emma looked surprised. "You do not know?" "No." Emma closed her book slowly. "Dad used to build computer companies." Sophie felt her heart sink. Confirmation somehow made the story even more real. "Really?" Emma nodded. "He was very successful." "What happened?" For the first time, Emma became quiet. The playful energy that usually surrounded her disappeared. She looked toward the fountain. "My mom got sick when I was little." Sophie remained silent. Emma continued. "Dad stopped working all the time." Her voice softened. "Then he stopped working almost completely." Sophie listened carefully. "Why?" Emma smiled sadly. "Because he wanted to spend time with her." The answer landed with enormous weight. Emma looked down at her hands. After she passed away, people wanted Dad to go back. Sophie already knew the rest before Emma said it. But he did not. Emma shook her head. "He said money could be earned again." A small smile appeared. "Time could not." Silence settled between them. The fountain splashed gently nearby. Children laughed in the distance. Yet Sophie barely heard any of it. Because for weeks she had assumed Mason was an ordinary man living an ordinary life. The truth was completely different. He had not failed. He had not lost everything. He had chosen something more important. Later that night, Sophie stood at her apartment window looking down into the lobby. Mason sat at the security desk reviewing paperwork exactly as he did every evening. Residents greeted him warmly. He smiled. He listened. He helped. Nothing about his behavior suggested regret. Nothing suggested he missed the wealth, status, or influence he once possessed. For the first time since meeting him, Sophie understood why everyone respected him so deeply. It was not because of what he accomplished before. It was because of what he gave up. And as she watched the quiet single father helping a resident carry groceries toward the elevator, Sophie realized she had just learned the most shocking truth of all. The wealthiest person she had met in years was the man who no longer seemed to care about wealth at all. For the next several days, Sophie Whitmore carried the truth like a secret she was not sure she deserved to know. Every time she saw Mason Carter, she saw him differently. Not because he had once been successful. Sophie knew many successful people. Most impressed her less the longer she knew them. What affected her was the choice he had made. The sacrifice. The willingness to walk away from prestige, influence, and extraordinary wealth for something no financial statement could measure. Yet Mason himself remained exactly the same. He greeted residents warmly. He helped neighbors without being asked. He laughed at Emma's jokes. He listened more than he spoke. Nothing about his behavior changed because nothing about his character depended on recognition. One evening, Sophie found herself standing in the lobby watching him speak with a new resident. The young man appeared nervous about moving into the building. Mason patiently answered questions, carried a box upstairs, and made the entire process easier. When he returned, Sophie was still there. "Can we talk?" she asked. Mason smiled. "Of course." They stepped into the courtyard. Autumn had deepened into early winter. Cool air drifted between the buildings. White lights decorated nearby trees. The city seemed quieter somehow. Sophie looked at him carefully. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Mason appeared confused. "Tell them what?" "Who you were." For a moment, neither moved. Then understanding crossed his face. He looked away toward the fountain. "I see." Sophie continued. "Most people would have mentioned it." Mason laughed softly. "Most people are not me." "No." Sophie shook her head. "They are not." Silence settled between them. Finally, Sophie asked the question that had lived inside her thoughts for days. "Do you ever regret it?" Mason looked surprised. "Regret what?" "Walking away." The answer came immediately. "Never." There was no hesitation. No uncertainty. Just certainty. Sophie stared at him. Mason smiled gently. "I love my work." His eyes drifted toward the apartment building where Emma lived. "But I love my family more." The simplicity nearly broke her heart. Because she believed him completely. At that moment, Emma burst into the courtyard carrying a school project. "Dad." Mason laughed. "There she is." Emma ran toward them. "Guess what?" "What?" "I got an A." Mason looked genuinely proud. "That is amazing." Emma smiled brightly. Sophie watched the interaction quietly. Suddenly everything made sense. The choice. The sacrifice. The life he built afterward. This was never a story about what Mason lost. It was a story about what he saved. A few days later, something unexpected happened. A senior executive visiting the residence recognized Mason immediately. The man froze in the lobby. "Mason Carter?" Several residents looked over. Mason smiled politely. "Hello, David." The executive appeared stunned. "I have not seen you in years." Within minutes, other people nearby began hearing fragments of the conversation. Stories emerged. Accomplishments surfaced. Old achievements entered the open. Residents who already respected Mason learned just how extraordinary his past had been. The reaction was remarkable. Nobody seemed impressed by the money. Nobody cared about former titles. What moved them was the reason he left it all behind. Conversations spread throughout the building. The elderly residents, the maintenance workers, the families. Everyone responded the same way. Quiet respect. One evening, the community organized a small holiday gathering in the courtyard. String lights glowed overhead. Children played near decorated trees. Neighbors shared food and stories. Sophie stood among them, watching something beautiful unfold. Residents approached Mason throughout the evening. Not to celebrate his former success. To thank him. "Thank you for helping when my husband was sick. Thank you for carrying groceries every week. Thank you for fixing things. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here." Each conversation ended the same way. Mason smiled awkwardly and tried changing the subject. The more people praised him, the less comfortable he seemed. Emma eventually whispered to Sophie, "He hates being the center of attention." Sophie laughed. "I noticed." As the evening continued, a strange stillness settled over the gathering. Not silence. Something deeper. A collective understanding. Everyone finally saw the full picture. The security guard. The father. The former entrepreneur. The neighbor. The friend. The man who could have lived almost any life he wanted and deliberately chose the one that mattered most. Sophie looked at Mason standing beneath the lights with Emma beside him. For weeks, she had admired his kindness. Then she respected his sacrifice. Now she understood something even more important. The secret that shocked her was never the success he left behind. It was the extraordinary character that remained after everything else was gone. And as the winter lights reflected softly across the courtyard, Sophie realized that some truths do not make a room louder when they are revealed. They make it wonderfully, respectfully quiet. Winter settled gently over the city in the weeks that followed. The public relations crisis that had once dominated Sophie Whitmore's life faded into memory. Reporters moved on. Investors found new topics to discuss. Headlines disappeared. Yet some changes remained. The biggest one stood in the lobby every evening wearing a security uniform and greeting residents with the same quiet smile. Mason Carter never changed after his secret became known. He still carried groceries. He still fixed broken benches. He still listened when people needed someone to talk to. If anything, he seemed slightly embarrassed by the attention. One evening, shortly before Christmas, Sophie found him decorating a small tree in the community courtyard with Emma. White lights reflected softly against the fresh snow resting on nearby rooftops. Families walked through the property carrying gifts and warm drinks. The entire building felt different. Closer, kinder, more human. Sophie stepped beside them. Need help? Emma smiled immediately. Yes. Mason laughed. You do not even know what she is helping with. That is okay. Emma handed Sophie a decoration. Now you are part of the team. Sophie hung the ornament carefully. For a moment, the three stood together in comfortable silence. Then Sophie looked toward Mason. Can I ask you one last question? Mason smiled. You usually do anyway. Emma laughed. Sophie shook her head. Fair point. The winter air felt crisp and clean. Soft music drifted from somewhere inside the building. Residents moved through the courtyard sharing greetings and laughter. It felt like the kind of evening people remembered years later. If you could go back, Sophie asked quietly, would you make the same choice again? Mason already knew what she meant. The company, the money, the success, everything he had left behind. His answer came without hesitation. Every single time. Sophie looked toward Emma. The young girl was carefully hanging another ornament while humming to herself. Mason followed her gaze. His expression softened. Success gave me opportunities, he said. But being her father gave me purpose. Sophie felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest. Not because the words sounded dramatic. Because they sounded true. Completely true. Emma finally finished decorating and stepped back proudly. Perfect. Mason smiled. I think you are right. Nearby residents began gathering for the annual community holiday celebration. Children laughed. Neighbors shared stories. Warm lights illuminated the courtyard. Sophie noticed something remarkable. People were naturally drawn toward Mason. Not because of his past achievements. Not because of money. Not because of influence. They were drawn toward him because he made them feel valued. Seen. Respected. Throughout her career, Sophie had spent years studying leadership. She attended conferences, read books, hired consultants. Yet standing there beneath the winter lights, she realized the greatest lesson had come from a security guard who never tried teaching anyone anything. Leadership was not authority. Wealth was not success. Influence was not recognition. The things that mattered most could not be measured on a spreadsheet. Later that evening, after the celebration ended, the courtyard gradually emptied. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the night air. The city lights glowed beyond the property walls. Sophie, Mason, and Emma remained near the decorated tree. Nobody seemed in a hurry to leave. You know, Sophie said quietly, when I first arrived here, I thought I understood what mattered. Mason smiled. And now? Sophie looked around. The families, the neighbors, the friendships, the community. Then she looked at Emma. Finally, she looked at Mason. Now I think I was learning the wrong lessons. Mason laughed softly. Life does that sometimes. Emma stepped between them and grabbed both of their hands. Good. Then everybody learned something. The simplicity of the statement made them laugh. Yet it was also true. Everyone had learned something. Sophie learned that dignity matters more than status. Residents learned that greatness often wears ordinary clothes. And Mason's story reminded everyone that the most valuable sacrifices are often invisible to the world. For several moments, nobody spoke. Snow continued falling. The tree lights shimmered gently. Emma stood between them, smiling at the peaceful scene around her. It was the kind of silence that could not be improved by words. The kind created when truth finally settles into people's hearts. Because in the end, the secret that shocked a CEO was never hidden wealth, forgotten success, or an extraordinary past. It was discovering that the strongest man she had ever met measured his life not by what he earned, but by who he loved. And somehow, that quiet choice became the richest story of all. If this story touched your heart, share where you are watching from, and tell us what moment stayed with you the most. And if you believe dignity, kindness, and second chances still matter in this world, we would be honored to have you join us for another story.